The Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and your local cable provider presents Cable Reports. Join us now as Cable Reports brings you up to date on current issues facing the Commonwealth through discussions with your local legislators and other policymakers from across Virginia.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Cox Communications, connecting Virginians to their government. We're very pleased to have Delegate Vivian with us this morning. Good to see you.
Good morning, Woody.
Now, you're one of the more experienced and knowledgeable members of the House of Delegates. I believe you were first elected in 1982.
That's
you
right.
became Secretary of Transportation and Public Safety for a period of time, and then you came back here. I think you're also the ranking member on Courts of Justice on Finance and Science and Technology now.
That's right, yep.
Great, great. Tell us how things are going on in your district.
My district has changed tremendously over the years that you're talking about. It's always had a heart around the outer part of Annandale, but I basically represent for all of your viewers, if you come into Northern Virginia, you're going to hit the mixing bowl when you hit the Beltway. So as you've crossed the Occoquan, I'm representing both sides of 95 up to the mixing bowl, all of the VRE coming in, the major metro station there, on up into Landmark, but then along the Beltway also, both sides as you make your way towards the Annandale campus of the community college and beyond. So I really have quite a spread, a lot of new voters, and as I go door to door, and of course I'm knocking on the doors of new American citizens, many of them never miss a chance to vote. Very diverse population because I have Cambodian and Thai and Korean and Japanese and Filipinos, but also Ethiopians, former Soviet bloc countries, most definitely Bangladesh, some of the Middle East, and then a lot of Latino countries where perhaps in El Salvador, for example, people who may had very advanced degrees are now living in the little red brick bungalows that were built right after World War II, which is the heart of my district.
So it creates quite a few challenges for their children in our public school system and the teachers as well.
That's absolutely correct. The average for my district, and this is something, again, is not really appreciated in Fairfax County, where averages as far as income look very, very good. But within my district, my average free and reduced lunch is over 40% in my elementary schools, and I certainly have elementary schools that have 60, 70% free and reduced lunch. And that's a federal measure of poverty that is the same nationwide. So it's not adjusted at all for cost of living in the area. And so, for example, housing is at least a third more expensive than the state as a whole. So this is a particularly strong burden. Having said that, I make it a point to always go to one of the high schools I represent with the Annandale Rotary Scholarships to interview a dozen applicants who are just amazing background with the strong emphasis on education being their future. And again, may have some language difficulties as they first came into the school system, but who are at the top of the class in most everything that they are involved with. I'm digressing, Woody, but one of the interesting things Annandale High School has done is part of English as a second language. They have a Shakespeare course.
Oh, really?
And they put on Shakespeare performances, marvelous performances.
Wow.
Again, that thirst for knowledge is really been a great spur to a number of the school programs.
So how many different languages?
Oh,
or spoken in the school districts?
I mean, the typical thing that you say about Fairfax as a whole is well over 120, 130 or more different heritage, but it's also the nuance of heritage. Notice, because of my experiences, I'm not talking about Asian countries. I'm talking about very different experiences. For example, you may be from Vietnam or Cambodia, but you might have been part of the intelligentsia, part of the military, or you might have been a boat person. Very, very different experiences, and you don't lump these things together.
You mentioned I-95, and of course we have the high occupancy toll lanes there with dynamic pricing. How have people adjusted to that?
Well, Woody, as you probably know, I've done so much on transportation financing over the years, and I have thought over the last decade or so, why am I being punished this way? Because actually, I had more than any other elected official, 30% of the right-of-way of the express toll lanes, dynamic tolling that were done on the Beltway between Springfield and Tyson's Corner. And then I got redistricted and have about 70% of the right-of-way on 95. As you perhaps know, Arlington stopped the completion of the project going all the way to the river, and so it stops right in my district, and people pour out there. But also I'm dealing with all of the interchange issues, and very, very much aware of the project as a whole as it extends down into Stafford, and how there were always plans, because what happens is perhaps in the future, I-66, for example, long-term plans, there would be rail in the I-66 corridor, just like from decades and decades and decades, rail to Dulles was always planned. Just like every other major airport in this nation, they have rail access as people in plane and so on. But it took many decades for that. What you have then is you work in those concentrations and the extreme costliness of fixed rail, and it has to serve real destination points to be efficient. On the Beltway or on 95, basically these are collector points where now let's think in terms of transit being express buses, carpools, van pools, and the famous slug lines of 95. But for that, on the 95 project, the collection points to allow people to get into multi-passenger vehicles are planned, but were never part of the project, as opposed to what's going forward in the I-66 planning, is to make these collection points part of the project so that you really can have the most efficient transit corridor. Having said that, 95, with Prince William's heritage of well, it's partly demographics. There's a much higher percentage of people in Prince William and in the 95 corridor that work in support positions. And so they have more regular hours, and therefore the collection points into multi-passenger vehicles work a lot better. In the first 3 months of full statistics for 95 express lanes, well over 20%, I think it's about 23%, of the usage was multi-passenger. So it really is a transit corridor, as well as that option for people on the dynamic tolling to be able to quickly get to their destination. One final thing on dynamic tolling to make sure it's understood. Dynamic tolling is all about, it's got to be worth paying for. So you've got to keep those speed limits, average speed at least 45 to 50 miles an hour. And that's why the price goes up as the congestion might increase, because you want to keep free flowing. And that is the whole balance that is trying to be achieved.
And I guess the other balance was to make sure people had an option.
Had an option, yeah. And what's interesting is one of the usages on an option, it's not just as they once were called, the Lexus lanes.
Right.
It's folks that have daycare that they have to get back for, and every minute that they're late, they get charged $1, and I was told by somebody, and if it's more than 10 minutes late, then it's $5 a minute. At that point, paying for the toll becomes something that allows the two-income families to have viable options as far as daycare.
Now, are there plans to extend the hot lanes beyond the Beltway now, up
Yes,
and
part
through
of the
district?
negotiation, and I've said it in so many forums, Woody. I should say it too in this broadcast. Secretary Lane's the best Secretary of Transportation I've ever worked with. As far as someone, one, he's a CPA, so he's systematic as far as the analysis and making sure. He really has reached out to the financial counselors and looking at these projects rather than just being a very limited look on some of our earlier 3P contracts that were signed. But most importantly, for those of us who represent the users and the citizens, what he is so open to hearing you, thinking about it, coming back with an option that this will address. He's always going after that compromise point of setting down, for example, the conditions, which are very reasonable conditions on I-66 inside the Beltway, of once these speed limit issues are raised, etc., then it's time to do that, take that bottleneck out between the Beltway and basically Fairfax Drive. That would be the widening. But the reason that that's an answer to the 95 being stopped instead of going all the way to the river, in negotiating this with Arlington, basically saying to Arlington, where this widening would take place, we will absolutely do everything we can to improve the throughput, and this being the transit and the HOV, and because of that, he was able to negotiate with Arlington then as far as the full extension of the 95 express lanes. Again, really looking at these environmental impact issues about, are there options that increase the throughput and reduce the number of vehicles?
Yeah, his approach seems to be a very good one in terms of looking at it holistically.
Yeah.
He gave a presentation yesterday before the House Appropriations Committee, and it was very interesting because one of the major focuses, as you know, and it's still controversial, is I-66. Yeah. Talk to us in a little bit more detail about some of the controversy surrounding that. It relates to tolling, but I think it's broader than that.
It's broader than that, and as I've occasionally reminded other members of the region, and it still comes down to what is the best regional plan on all of this. But, hey guys, I endured the express lanes on the Beltway and 95 basically on my own. You all were out here, and in both of those cases as well, two other very significant differences is that basically the contract was signed with no public input, whereas on I-66, sometimes you're be careful what you ask for, in the sense that Lane really came forward, the Commonwealth Transportation Board really came forward with full options for input. There have been many, many changes since that first plan was put out, but it's also made it all the more controversial as people want a whole loaf, not half a loaf, in what they see as impact. So that's a big difference, is that there's really public input on I-66, and that also full analysis of 95 in the Beltway. This is totally, all that toll goes to private profit, as opposed to looking at I-66 and saying, on the tolls, what's that balance between using this toll revenue for public benefit, like Rail to Dulles. Was the use of partly funded by tolls, the users of the Dulles corridor, to make that corridor work better, taking a lot of traffic off through extending rail. The same kind of thing would be true as you look at I-66, with initially looking at significantly enhanced transit. But with that then comes the toll issue and the understanding of dynamic tolling, that if you did the absolute highest toll, that became the campaign, oh my
Sure.
God, as opposed to what the average toll would be, which would be more in the terms of $3 to $4, that during off-peak hours, it's, for example, on the Beltway, it's basically $1. Nobody's really, but the other unique thing about I-66 inside the Beltway is that it is the only one of all of these facilities I've been clicking off that has no anything other than HOV. It doesn't have
Right.
outer lanes.
Right.
And so that also becomes part of the issue as you think in terms of capacity being throughput of people and not just number of vehicles. Are you enhancing the throughput of people and therefore increasing the capacity? Or do you define capacity only by the number of lanes? Outside the Beltway I-66, it's the same capacity, adding HOV lanes. But inside the Beltway, that's not an option. It's always been just an HOV facility.
Now, you had mentioned earlier HB2, which sets forth some very specific criteria, and you indicated that a report was recently...
The report just came out, which ranked all of the major projects that localities have asked the CTB, the Commonwealth Transportation Board, to rank. And this is something, HB2 is a very important initiative. Many Northern Virginians were behind it. I think it's fair to say that a leader was current Delegate Lemunyon in saying, if we're going to raise this revenue, if we're going to spend this revenue, let's now spend it in the most efficient way as far as reducing congestion. So that there is, as far as Northern Virginia is concerned, elsewhere in the state, in addition to congestion measurements, you're also looking at safety issues and more economic, some of the economic development. But it's a much better than I've ever seen look statewide comparisons closer to apples and apples comparison. What is the biggest bang for your buck? What can we get the most benefit from? And on that list, I-66, with a dynamic tolling component and improvement of transit, is the best bang for the buck. It's at the top of the list. But if we do away with tolls, the project falls way down. So if you take out the tolls, you don't get the project. And so you have to say, are the conditions such that they really need to be addressed, which the HB2 ranking said absolutely the conditions are such that they need to be addressed. But they have to be addressed when that cost-benefit balance with tolls. It's not beneficial to try to wait forever and ever and ever for the cost of this facility to be built just solely out of gas tax revenue. The estimate that I heard the other day was that if we were to take it solely out of gas tax revenue, it'd be a 1/3 increase in the gas tax. And
As a
so
matter
this
of
is
fact,
the balance of funding. There will be some state funding in, but there'll also, this is all the options going, as well as public-private partnership aspects of it, et cetera.
and of course, you were instrumental in that 2013 legislation, which created the...
I still can do an all-nighter to put the numbers together.
But no one anticipated gas prices going down as drastically as they have, so that's obviously had an adverse impact on the revenues.
Well, two things have happened, so it's good news and bad news. First, let me emphasize the good news. The smart thing we did in the 2013 was just, it's a percentage of wholesale price, but we set a floor as of the time we passed the bill. So even though prices have gone down, as far as statewide collection, it stays at that same level. Having said that, there's a real impact, however, in as far as Virginia Rail Express, VRE, and Metro funding, because there the regional 2% taxes are based instead on the whole fluctuation. They don't have the floor. And so they have really, really taken a big hit because of that. Back to the statewide picture, it is true what we anticipated as increased prices going up when we were making projections about the revenue availability in the next 5, 10, 15 years. That has not materialized. We've stayed at the floor. So the revenue hasn't gone down, it just hasn't gone up in what was projected because we were expecting prices to still increase from that floor.
So you had mentioned slugs earlier, and of course that's a phenomenon that's non-government related or regulated. Some people were concerned about the impact of the hot lanes on that, but I understand that that concern no longer exists.
Absolutely. Again, because you can ride free, it is absolutely as much or more an incentive. The lanes are much more are run much smoother because the number of offenders when you had HOV lanes that had no barrier, I think the number of offenders I know was over 20%. So that was really clogging up the lanes. So now the incentive as far as speed and being able to ride free is just that much greater to form the slug lines.
And you also mentioned public-private partnerships, and that's one of the ways to ensure that the risk is not borne by taxpayers, it's borne by the private entity. How has that worked out in general?
Well, you use the word risk, and that's a very informed distinction. The risk, should everything go belly up, is not on the taxpayer, it's on the private, and they would lose it, and it actually revert back to the taxpayers. But I have to absolutely underscore that all of this is being paid by the taxpayer who's driving. That it's being paid by tolls. It's not a gift from the private sector. It's they had enough money up front to build the facility when there wasn't that kind of money available on the public side, and that's why it became a P3. And they could take those risks of saying, we look at the traffic here. And by the way, they insisted in the P3 reform of, I think it was several years ago, that it has to be HOV3. That's another part of the controversy of whether it's 2 or 3. So that becomes another part of the aspect. But let me also underscore when we say taxpayer that these transit options that I'm talking, whether it's the free slugs or whether it's getting on an express bus, this is absolutely critical for the income range, so that you have good options, available options for low and moderate income, for the support workers who really need to have that option, and allowing that, putting in these facilities that allow that free passage is every bit as important, if not more so. And of course you have the environmental benefits of taking vehicles off the road, than it is to also give the options for the people who are late for a meeting in Tyson's Corner and are dealing with Northern Virginia traffic. You
mentioned how the I-66 project cannot go forward absent tolling. There are at least half a dozen bills in, most of them in opposition, the ones that I have seen. I take it this is just all part of the discussion?
I sincerely hope so. And as part of the discussion, they do set one of the bookends. But in that, we are talking about, again, reverse toll. All of these issues are absolutely in play as you pare down to the absolute minimum, and how the benefits of these tolls are utilized, and really look at, if you don't have tolls, can we really stand not to have the project? How could those are the two bookends.
Sure. You also mentioned Dulles and rail to Dulles. Of course, Metro goes to Wheelie Avenue now, I believe.
But it's under construction all the way out.
Right, and I think we're the only world capital without rail from a major airport into, like Dulles, into the capital city.
I've hardly touched the definition of a world traveler. I've done a little bit, but certainly even within the United States, those airports that where my kids have moved to, so you fly to see them. Yeah, exactly. It's really a very important part of the total economic picture, as well as the convenience factor that we've needed.
Talk to us a little bit. There's some legislation you have regarding additional powers for counties.
Oh, thank you for bringing that up. Basically, all counties in Virginia, with little exception for Arlington and Henrico, and that's history, our taxing structure was set in the 1700s. Fairfax County, with 1.2 million people, is governing itself as if it were still a rural county in 1700 with a real estate tax. Whereas every city in Virginia, big or small, was regarded in 1930, notice we're getting close to 100 years ago on that, in 1930 as having the sophistication that basically the code reads that unless a tax is prohibited to you, you provide for the needs of your citizens, and it's going to be the ballot box that is going to determine whether or not you have done properly. So in reality, what we're talking about then is the tax on food, lodging, food being meals, lodging, and cigarette taxes. So I'm sitting in a situation where I believe Falls Church or Alexander has more than $1 per pack on cigarettes, and revenue comes in from that. And then the example that I love giving, Woody, and I confess I'm addicted to big gulp refills from 7-Eleven, and I've got a 52-ounce cup, which is the absolute cusp for getting it refilled for 99 cents. So in Fairfax County, I pay $1.01. In the city of Fairfax, just down the road, I pay $1.05. In the town of Vienna, I pay $1.05. In Richmond, I pay $1.08. Down in Hampton Roads, I've paid as much as $1.11, I think it is. This is the revenue that is available, and much of this drive comes out of the serious problem that we have in K through 12 funding.
Sure.
That are the composite index, and I have language in on that as well. The composite index, which determines how much a locality gets in state support, is driven 40% by adjusted gross income of the region. We can't tax the adjusted gross income. We can only tax people's property. And I mentioned World War II red brick bungalows. The people who've lived in those their entire lives, the value on that property is nowhere near their ability to pay.
Right. Well, I think we've had as much fun as we can stand. They tell me we're running out of time.
It's always fun being with you.
Absolutely. Keep up the good work. Good
Thank
luck
you.
In the next, 50-so-odd days?
I'm not counting.
Thank you for being here, Delegate Vivian Watt.
Thank you, Woody.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Cox Communications. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans.
All right, that was relaxing.
Mm-hmm.